I'm going to talk a lot today about sort of the Western U.S. and some examples of potential impacts of climate change on the West. But I think, or I hope, that as I go through this, you guys will be thinking about, the ecosystems where you come from, ecosystems around the Northeast and around Massachusetts, and seeing sort of parallels in terms of the big questions that we need to be thinking about relative to both invasive plants and ecological restoration in the context of climate change. So this slide is a picture from western Nevada, and what you're seeing here is actually pretty typical of a lot of western Nevada. This land in the front here is dominated by one particular invasive plant species called cheatgrass, which in this landscape is dominating a near monoculture. I'm going to talk a fair bit. I'm going to use cheatgrass as sort of an example through this, but I just wanted to give you a sense in this opening slide of sort of the scale that this is going on all the way up to the foothills of these mountains, just an ecosystem that was formerly fairly diverse in terms of shrubs and native bunch grasses and is now pretty much entirely a single species across these really huge, vast landscapes. So I just wanted to start out by laying a little bit of framework in terms of how we're thinking about global change and its impacts on ecosystems. And this is a slide from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So this is now about 10 years old, but we're still sort of thinking in the same kind of qualitative framework. And what you're looking at here is a bunch of different ecosystems, and this is just a sampling of the ones that they were looking across. So here's an example of different forests and dryland ecosystems. And what we're considering is how are the different ways that these ecosystems might change, both having changed in the past and changing in the future. And here are some of the dominant forms of global change. So habitat change, that is land use, land cover change. We put in a road. How does that disturbance affect an ecosystem? Climate change, particularly in terms of rising CO2 and its impact on ecosystems and changing precipitation and temperature regimes. Invasive species, you'll notice here, are put on as a component of global change. So non-native species that have been introduced either intentionally or accidentally and are having large-scale impacts on ecosystems. Overexploitation of resources, pollution in forms of nitrogen and phosphorus, whether that's through fertilizers or other types of emissions. Those are the major components of global change identified by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And so this is a way of looking at it in terms of what impacts have those different forms of global change had over the last 100 years, and what types of impacts are we expecting them to have over the future 100 years. And all of these colors and arrows are relative to biodiversity, so the impacts of these different types of global change on biodiversity across a range of different ecosystems. So the colors are indicative of the impact over the last century, that is the last 100 years, going from this kind of like tan color of not too much impact at all, relative to climate change especially, all the way up to, in a couple of examples, very high impact on biodiversity. So for example, deforestation in tropical forests has had a pretty huge impact over the last 100 years. Then the next thing to look at is the arrows. So the arrows are in terms of what we're expecting these impacts to have on ecosystems and biodiversity over the coming century, the next 100 years. And what you can see looking across these is that most of the arrows are pointing upward. So an upward pointing arrow indicates a very rapid increase of that impact. So if you look at climate change, for example, what you see is we have seen a pretty low impact so far of climate change on biodiversity, but we're expecting over the next 100 years to see a very large and rapid increase in that impact on ecosystem conservation and biodiversity. Similarly for invasive species, maybe not as much impact, but seeing a lot of rapid impact. And so essentially what this is saying is we've seen some changes in the past, but we're expecting to see a lot more changes to come in the future. So this provides us a really good kind of qualitative framework for thinking about what types of things and in what types of ecosystems do we need to be concerned about, do we need to be thinking about. But from a management type perspective, what we really want is much more of a quantitative knowledge of not just that climate change is going to increase risks to tropical forests, But how is it going to increase risk to tropical forests, and where specifically can we maybe do something about it? And then sort of what should we be doing about it? So those are the types of questions that I'm really interested in. Can we use a biogeographical perspective or an ecological perspective, lots of different perspectives, to get at more of that quantitative framework, answers to pretty specific questions? So what I'm going to talk about today is actually intersecting these two types of global change, climate change and invasive species. And I'm going to be asking some pretty specific quantitative questions of how does climate change affect the potential distribution of invasive species, and what does that mean for risk and potential opportunities for restoration of invasive plants. I'm going to look specifically across the western US. So I just wanted to start with this. These are a bunch of different titles of papers that have come out relatively recently, so within the last 5 or 10 years, thinking about what are the relationships between plant invasion and climate change. And you can see across all of these that there's a big concern of things like favored aliens of the future. Will climate change promote alien plant invasions? Does global change increase the success of biological invaders? There's a lot of concern in the scientific community that climate change, because it is such a large form of disturbance, and because invasive plants and not just plants, but all invasive species respond so positively to disturbance, does this mean that that's going to facilitate plant invasion even more than we've already seen? So what are some ways that that could happen? One example of a potential interactions between plant invasion and global change is in terms of increased CO2 in the atmosphere. So what does higher CO2 in the atmosphere do for plants? Well, it helps all plants. I mean, it's generally, it's sort of like a fertilizing effect across all plants because plants are essentially breathing CO2. So we could expect that some invasives will be favored because of that, those that grow faster than the natives that they're invading or have more efficient photosynthetic pathways, but not necessarily all of them. What we do know, though, from a management perspective at least, is that they will probably be bigger faster and therefore harder to kill. So however much Roundup you would be using on a particular weed in your yard, you might require a lot more Roundup for that particular weed, or it might recover easier. This is just an example of pictures using, so this is the same time period in the life cycle of Canada thistle, which is a big problematic invasive plant across northern states, so Montana, Idaho, those areas. This is under ambient CO2, so current CO2 concentration, and this is up to 550 parts per million, so about 150 parts per million higher. And so 550 is actually kind of the lowest trajectory of what futures might be like, too. Same stage in the life history of Canada thistle, you can see that under that higher CO2, it's a lot bigger. And this is a thistle, too, so you don't want to pull it up. It's pretty nasty stuff. What else is another interaction between plant invasion and global change is disturbance. So we see lots of evidence of preferential invasion along disturbance corridors. So, for example, road building facilitates invasion because plants tend to invade along the edges of roads. Power lines, similar to roads, you create a big corridor of disturbance, and invasives invade along that. So if you have something like continued land use, you continue to build roads, you continue to develop on houses at that wildland-urban interface, so out into the boonies where people want to live in the exurbs. Energy infrastructure is another potential problem, especially when we're talking about alternative energies and developing large solar and wind farms. That energy has to be brought to the cities somehow, and so those are expected land use that we can continue to expect to enable invasion into the future. And then changing precipitation and temperature also likely to affect the viability of individual plant species. So these are just some maps showing drought in Australia and increased heat waves in Europe. So if you have large-scale shifts in climate conditions, that affects whether plants can survive in that particular location. If it gets too dry for a plant, it may no longer be viable in that area. If it gets too hot for a plant, it may no longer be viable. So that at the global scale is likely to shift the potential distribution of both invasive plants and native plants. So a lot of shifting baselines, essentially, of what plant communities may exist in any given location because of changing precipitation and temperature. And so I'm going to focus on this last one. Well, we know that CO2, disturbance, and other factors are also going to be playing a role in this. But for this case, let's just look at changing precipitation and temperature and see what we can learn from that. And so I'm just going to quickly give you a presentation outline. I'm first going to talk about ecological forecasting using a biogeographical approach. Then I'm going to talk about, specifically present some envelope model projections for Western invasive species. So those are models specific to biogeography. And then I'm going to talk for a little bit about sort of the next steps and the frameworks that we need to be thinking about ecosystem restoration in the context of global change. So I just want to start that first section of talking about biogeographical modeling by putting up this slide, which I really just want you to get the indication that there are a lot of different methods for predicting the future. So you can use models, experiments, theory, observations, and you could probably list dozens under each of these categories for how we figure out what the future might look like. And in this case, I'm just going to pick one of those. I'm using one of these different methods, so there might be lots of other different methods to do this. But I'm going to show you some results from this one. And this one method is called species distribution modeling. It's also called climate envelope modeling. So when you hear me say envelope a lot, I'm referring to the same thing. So what is species distribution modeling? Well, I'll start with the strengths and the weaknesses of it, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about what it specifically is. This is a map based on a species distribution model for Mexican plants. And essentially what it's doing is saying, where are the areas that these plants can no longer survive? So the red areas on this map are showing areas where a species currently exists, but with climate change may no longer be viable. And then the gray areas are ones where the species there are probably still going to survive with climate change. So the conditions in the future are similar to the ones today. So the good thing about that is that it provides a regional projection. So the whole country of Mexico, all of the US, all of North America, you can do this with this type of modeling. It's spatially explicit. Spatially explicit means I can look at an area on a map right here and say high risk versus an area on the map over here that's low risk. The negatives of this are that it's empirical. So essentially you're looking at relationships between factors, statistical relationships. You're comparing a species distribution to a climate variable. So you're not putting in things like biotic interactions. You're not inherently accounting for competition with native species or other factors that you might want to put in a type of model that would project the future. And then the biggest problem of this, and this is probably true of any types of ecological forecasting, is that we have a big question mark in terms of our confidence. Do we know, can we say that this is 10% accurate or 90% accurate or somewhere in between? We really don't know the answer to that question because the answer to that lies in whatever the future lies, or in being able to go forward in time, which we can't do right now, and test whether indeed that species is extinct in this location that we predicted. So those are some strengths and weaknesses of this approach. The actual approach is, so establishing a climate envelope, a species distribution model, says first we take the distribution of an abiotic factor. So my abiotic factor in this case is going to be climate. And this is average precipitation across the US, going from blue is really high to red, and that kind of yellow and red colors are really low. And then I'm going to use that climate to try to predict where my species occurs. So you can imagine that your species might exist across some portion of the US or some portion of North America, but it doesn't exist everywhere in North America. It's just a portion of it. So let's say, for argument's sake, that we're just interested in the Western US, and the Western US happens to plot out as this nice circle relative to these two climate variables. So this could be precipitation versus temperature, temperature versus temperature, whatever you want, some types of climate variables. And anywhere that you go in the western U.S., you're somewhere within this circle. So this point up here could be high temperature, high precipitation. This point down here is low temperature, low precipitation. Over here, you've got high precipitation, low temperature, so on. Okay? Now, we know that our species is not everywhere in the western U.S. It's within some subset of the western U.S. So let's say we have these two, and let's say for argument's sake that these are both invasive species. So if we go to a location in the western U.S. and we find ourselves here relative to these two climate variables, then we can say, okay, relative to where these two species are distributed across the West, this climate condition is not similar to either of those. And so probably this location, wherever I am, is not at risk of invasion from either species 1 or species 2, because the climate conditions are such that, you know, where the species is now, it's not growing in this type of climate condition. But you could also go out to a point that's right about here in the western U.S., and you may not see either species 1 or species 2 there currently, but if you want to think about risk from both of them, then you could say that this point right here, both of these species are potentially suitable. They can survive in climate conditions like the one that I'm standing in, even if they're not here now. And so I could label this location potentially at risk of invasion. So I'm just going to run you through some examples for cheatgrass. This is that same species that I showed you in the starting slide. This is another part of sort of central Nevada of a large landscape that's dominated by this particular invasive species. Okay, so what are the problems with this? So this, of course, would normally, before it turned into a cheatgrass monoculture, was sagebrush. Sagebrush is a habitat, provides critical habitat for things like the greater sage grouse, which is not yet listed as endangered, but they've been debating listing it as an endangered species for quite a long time, or the pygmy rabbit, which is also a rare species across the West. So you lose sagebrush, you lose native species. If you are invaded by cheatgrass, you also have problems for the economic viability of this landscape. So these are kind of the two main industries across the western U.S. or across these types of lands. Agriculture, this is an alfalfa field being invaded by cheatgrass on the edge. This invasion cuts down on the yield of a lot of agricultural crops. It also affects grazing. These are open range for the most part in a lot of these landscapes. Cattle can eat cheatgrass for a very short time period while it's green, but after that it creates a lot of problems like getting stuck in their ears and causing digestive problems and stuff like that. So by the time you see one that's brown like this and not green anymore, it's no longer viable rangeland. So pretty big economic costs. And then on top of that, we've got a strong link between this invasive species and fire cycles in the western U.S. So there's one estimate up in the Snake River Plain where they were looking at fire return frequency. And in the native system of sagebrush-dominated shrublands, fire returns are on the order of 60 to 100 years. With cheatgrass invasion, that drops to about every 5 years. So that's a really huge change in just the functioning of this ecosystem because you've introduced this really fast return disturbance of fire across a landscape. And that, of course, has cascading effects. So things like if you burn a landscape and you clear it of any kind of vegetation, you get a lot more soil runoff. And especially if you're talking about large areas of the western U.S. where you have a lot of dams, soil runoff is a big problem. You have to dredge behind dams. So there are a lot of cascading effects of this. Of course, for people living out there, repeat fire cycle is also a problem. Fortunately, we have some distribution maps of cheatgrass across the western U.S. This gives you kind of a scale of the problem. So these are areas that are dominated by cheatgrass across the western U.S. It's huge, probably 40,000 square kilometers dominated by this invasive species. I'm not sure how that relates to the area of Massachusetts. I lived in Rhode Island for a long time, and I know it was like 5 or 6 times the size of the state of Rhode Island. That's probably about the size of the state of Massachusetts, basically dominated by this single species. Okay, so how do we establish a climate envelope? So this is just another way of looking at that graph that I showed you earlier of the rainfall versus the area of species distribution. So you can imagine, in this case, I'm just going to do it in one dimension. So a single climate variable, so this is precipitation, temperature, whatever you want, relative to the land area across that climate variable. So let's say, for argument's sake, our total distribution, everything in the western U.S. forms this nice regular curve with most of the land area in the middle of this climate variable, whatever that is. And our invasive distribution is this kind of like chicken pox one down on the low end of this climate variable. So if you want to talk about risk relative to distribution, the land area that you might consider at risk of invasion are all the areas that have similar climate conditions to this particular climate variable. So here's our land area at risk. So we can do that for cheatgrass. And here's an example of invasion risk relative to current distribution of cheatgrass. So the black on here are all the areas that cheatgrass is currently invaded, and the red on here are all the areas that have climate conditions that are similar to the areas that it's already invaded. So if you're talking about risk, of course, this is pretty bad, right? There's a lot of land area that has similar climate conditions to what has currently been invaded. And indeed, a lot of these areas are already invaded to somewhat low levels. So there's a lot of concern not just of what's already invaded in the western U.S., but what's continuing to be invaded. So based on this, it's pretty clear that this particular species has not occupied all of the land area that it could possibly occupy across the West. So let's talk a little bit about what potentially happens using this model with climate change. So here's our current model under current climate conditions, our invasive distribution, and our at-risk location. So two possibilities. One is that this is the worst case climate change scenario. So under this scenario, climate conditions shift in such a way that's favorable to the distribution of this invasive plant. So in this case, there's a lot more land area that now, because climate conditions have changed, this particular species really likes it. So you have an increased area that's at risk of invasion, not just the land area that was at risk previously. But there's another possibility, and that is sort of our best case climate change scenario. Now, in this case, our climate variable has shifted in a direction that's not favorable to this particular invasive species. And we have a couple things happening. The first is all this land area up here that was previously at risk of invasion is no longer at risk because that species can't survive under these new climate conditions. And then something else that's kind of interesting happens, and that is here we've got some areas that are currently invaded by this species, and now our climate conditions have moved away so that this large portion of already invaded land area might potentially no longer persist in that area, could potentially retreat from it. So following through with that cheatgrass example, if you look at the relationship to climate, these are the variables that cheatgrass is best modeled by. So the best predictors of distribution happen to be summer precipitation, average annual precipitation, spring precipitation, and winter maximum temperature. So a couple interesting things about this. Precipitation is really important for the distribution of western invasive species. And that's not just true of cheatgrass, that's actually true of several western invasive species, which makes sense because you're talking about arid landscapes where water is generally the limiting factor. So maybe they can survive across a range of temperatures, but precipitation becomes really important. So if we want to move from that sort of qualitative framework into more of a quantitative framework, what we really need is to say, what is future precipitation going to look like across the western U.S.? And then how does that more specifically affect cheatgrass distribution? So let's look at projections of precipitation change. So this is a projection of change for the Intermountain West, that is all the land area between the Rockies and the Sierras, using one climate model. So if you guys are familiar with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, invited lots of different climate modeling groups. So they probably have 20-something different models of what future climate will look like across the globe based on particular scenarios of what change will be. So this is one. This is NCAR, so this is a US-based model. And we're looking at percent change in precipitation across all of these different months. And then I've got a point at the end for the annual average change. So if you look across these, you can say, okay, well, based on this NCAR model, maybe we'll have a little bit higher winter precipitation, but probably about the same. Not sure what's going on with this point, but maybe slightly lower in the spring, maybe slightly higher in the summer, and maybe slightly lower in the fall. But overall, not a whole lot of change, just slightly higher. Okay, so that's one model. So let's look at a bunch of different models. Okay, so now we've got 10 different models, all from that IPCC scenario. All of these actually selected specifically because they do the best job of modeling past precipitation globally. So these are the ones that are best at precipitation, 10 out of those 22 or whatever we have. And you can see that we end up with some problems in particular seasons. So in the wintertime, maybe pretty consistent in terms of a slight increase in winter precipitation. Springtime, maybe pretty consistent in terms of a slight decrease of spring precipitation. But in the summertime, we've got a real issue here of anywhere from a loss of 50% of precipitation to a gain of 50% or even more of precipitation. And if we recall that the best predictors of cheatgrass distribution was summer precipitation. So clearly, if we have this big range of how summer precipitation is going to change, that's going to strongly affect what our projections of cheatgrass response to that precipitation change may be. As ecologists, this is something that we need to deal with, that there's going to be a large degree of uncertainty in terms of future projections. We can't just sit around and wait for the climate modelers to agree, because that may never happen. Probably by the time it happens, we'll have already measured those data points, so we'll know what they are. It'll be 2100 at that point. We can stick a thermometer out the window. So what we need to do is to figure out ways to deal with this level of uncertainty and try to figure out what the potential ecological consequences are. Okay, so here's one way, and that is to do a sensitivity analysis. So let's say we know that there's a big range in potential summer precipitation in the future. What is the potential impact of those two changes on the distribution of cheatgrass? So what I'm showing here is, on the one hand, the impact of a 50% increase in summer precipitation, and on the other hand, a 50% decrease in summer precipitation. So in both of these, what you're looking at, the black areas are those that maintain suitability. So that is, under current climate conditions, cheatgrass is viable, can exist, a suitable climate in those areas. And under either of these two scenarios, in the future, those black areas continue to be suitable for this particular species. The blue areas are ones that are currently climatically suitable for this species, but in these particular areas, under this scenario, they lose suitability. So that is, they're no longer climatically viable for that species. And then the red areas are ones that gain suitability. That is, currently, they're not suitable for this species, but under this scenario, they become suitable for this species. So obviously, big differences between what happens if you increase summer precipitation or what happens if you decrease summer precipitation. But there are several things that we can learn from this. First is, where are the sweet spots for cheatgrass invasion? Where are the areas that we're going to have to continually deal with this problematic species pretty much no matter what happens with climate? So Snake River Plain, eastern Washington, sort of north-central Nevada. Not a whole lot changes in those areas, no matter what you do. And these are pretty big potential changes in climate conditions. Another is, where are the potential big risks? So Montana shows up as a really big risk of areas that, yeah, maybe we could debate about the likelihood of this scenario actually happening, but hey, this could be a really big problem if it does happen. And so maybe we want to think in terms of, how do we manage any small invasions that have already taken place in these areas? How do we make these ecosystems more resilient or resistant to cheatgrass invasion? And then another thing that's interesting about this from sort of a species competitive interactions perspective is that for me, having worked on this particular species for a while, when this came up and summer precipitation was the best predictor of cheatgrass distribution, I was like, that's really weird. That doesn't make any sense to me because cheatgrass is dead in the summer. Basically, its life cycle is that it greens up in the springtime. It's green for about 6 to 8 weeks, and then it dies in probably early June. And these models are June, July, August, September is what we're dealing with. So in fact, my hypothesis to this then is what we're dealing with here is not models relative to the species itself and what the species can survive, and the conditions that the species can survive in, but rather a competitive interaction with the native species, native ecosystems that it's invading. So how would that work? Well, if you increase summer precipitation, the native ecosystems that the species is invading are perennials. That is, they're living through the summertime. They're living for multiple years. They're growing primarily in the summertime. And so if you increase summer precipitation, does that give more advantage to the native species over the invasive species? Does that make them more resistant or resilient? And then the other thing that's kind of interesting is if you increase or if you change summer precipitation, another thing that happens is it affects the fire cycle. So most of these fires are burning in July and August, these times when it's really, really dry in the western U.S. So if you make it a little bit wetter, maybe you reduce those numbers of fires across these landscapes and then prevent cheatgrass from invading behind it. And similarly, if you decrease summer precipitation, so here's a whole land area that's currently the same shrubland, so this is sagebrush for the most part, sagebrush and grasslands. If you decrease summer precipitation up there just a little bit, you make it more like the Great Basin desert, and maybe you increase that fire frequency and allow this invasive species to invade. So those are some hypotheses that you can develop using this type of modeling approach that then are potentially testable, right? You can imagine going out and setting up some experiments or observations in these different areas that this type of modeling approach can point out. All right, so that's one approach to looking at what future conditions might be like. I want to talk about another approach. So sensitivity analysis gives you some insight, but we also want to know what's our best guess of what the future might look like, not just these sort of like change one thing one way and change it the other way. So this is an approach that's been starting to gain a lot of traction, it's been used a lot, and it's called ensemble modeling. So what we're doing in an ensemble is we're taking a bunch of different climate models, so these are different views, different expert opinions of what the future might look like, and we're saying, let's look at all of these individually and then see where they overlap. So we're going to produce a model of potential risk for all of these 10 different models and then add them all together to look at areas where the different models agree or disagree, and maybe we have more confidence in the areas where multiple different projections agree. So here's an example of an ensemble model for cheatgrass risk and distribution in the future. So what you're seeing here in the colors is representative of the number of suitable atmosphere, ocean, general circulation models. So the number of climate models that predict that that species will retain viability or gain viability. So in red are areas of high risk out here. So the red areas are ones where 5 or more, so more than half of the models, say that this land area is still going to be at risk of invasion under these future climate conditions. The hash marks on here are areas where that risk has expanded. So you can see a couple of things on here. Again, the Snake River Plain shows up as an area of not a lot of change happening. Pretty much whatever you do to climate, cheatgrass remains viable and an invasive threat in that land area. But you can see some other areas like these valleys in the Rockies foothills, this area in southwestern Wyoming, where you end up with much larger invasion potential with climate change. So this area might not be currently at risk, but a lot of different models say that that area will become at risk with climate change. And then you have another interesting thing going on here, and those are the areas that are coming up in dark blue. So these are areas that cheatgrass is currently at risk, so at risk of invasion across southern Nevada, southern Utah, those areas. And 0 out of those 10 climate models say that that land will still be climatically suitable for that invasive species. That is, these are areas of reduced risk with climate change, may no longer be suitable in those areas. And so maybe we don't have to worry as much about cheatgrass invasion in those particular locations because climate change might kick it out a little. And there's sort of a corollary to that, and that's where are the areas that cheatgrass has already invaded relative to that same scale. So again, already invaded large portions of the Snake River Plain, not a lot of change projected to happen. So whatever climate change happens, this area is still that kind of sweet spot for invasion. But we see a lot of these land areas in southern Nevada, western Nevada, where cheatgrass is currently invaded. In fact, those pictures that I showed you before are from someplace around here out west, really dominating on these landscapes, and yet all of the different models suggest that these land areas will no longer be able to support that particular species with climate change. So I just wanted to walk through a couple of other examples of different invasive species, and you'll have to take my word for it that these are all pretty nasty invasive species across the western U.S. and pretty big and problematic ones that have been around for a long time. Yellow star thistle. So this is an invasive species, primarily a problem in California, and what you're seeing here is that mainly what we're seeing is increased risk associated with this species. So a lot of hash marks of expanded risk, not a lot of that dark blue color anywhere on here that would suggest lessened risk. And similarly, if you're thinking in terms of will that invasive species survive or potentially retreat, pretty high risk across this whole landscape. Here's a different story, though, and this is one from spotted knapweed, which is problematic across, well, you can see across large portions of Montana and then several other states in the northern Rockies. So this one is more a story of shifting risk. So in some areas, you see large patches of this dark blue of reduced risk. And then at the same time, you're seeing a lot of these hash marks over kind of the red tones of high evidence of increased risk. So this one looks like it's more moving, probably what it's doing is moving up some of these mountain edges into slightly cooler terrains. And similarly, where the species persists, we've got both evidence of retreat and potential evidence of persistence in large areas as well. Tamarisk is an example. Actually, this is one that we don't know too much about, or not that we don't know too much about, but the climate actually does a very poor job of modeling just generally. So pretty much it's all over the western U.S., and as you might expect from that, if it's everywhere, then the climate model is going to reflect that it can pretty much invade anywhere, whatever climate conditions you want. So not much of a story of change associated with climate change because since it's already everywhere, it can just sort of stay everywhere. Leafy spurge is an interesting example of a mainly retreat or reduced risk story. So this is one where we don't see much in the way of hash marks of increased risk. Mainly what we're seeing are these dark blue tones of reduced risk across the northern states. And similarly, for areas that it's already invaded, there's a big patch in part of Nebraska where you have large infestations and potential retreat associated with climate change. Of course, our maps cut off right at the northern border with Canada, so you can imagine that actually the increased risk, the story may actually be a shift into Canada as opposed to just a wholesale retreat from the U.S. So what do all of those different stories together tell us about what the future might look like in terms of invasive plants and climate? So what we see from those different models that I just ran through is that 2 out of 5 invasive plants, tamarisk and yellow star thistle, show mainly expanded risk. But 3 out of 5 of those invasive plants show mainly reduced risk, so that is reduced viability associated with climate change. So, of course, this is only 5 species, but that may be illustrative of sort of the global picture of what's going to be happening with invasive plants and climate change. If about half expand and about half contract, that's not the same as where we started out with, that like wholesale expansion of invasive plants with climate change. Maybe this is a little bit, kind of a twist on that story of there may be some real opportunities associated with reduced risk. So what does that mean for the next century? that really this is highlighting the possibility that these intractable invasive species may be less viable with climate change. So if cheatgrass can no longer survive, cheatgrass is gone from this landscape, then the question is, what happens to that landscape? So can we say, sweet, we'll just sit back and have a cup of tea and sagebrush will come back in and everything will be happy and climate change has solved our problems? Well, if you do the models for sagebrush, so now this is the main native dominant in these areas, what you see is that actually the same areas that are at risk for cheatgrass, now the colors are reversed because this is the native species. So red here is high risk to the native. So cheatgrass might retreat, but sagebrush can't survive either in these areas of southern Nevada. And then similarly, the areas where cheatgrass does survive pretty well, sagebrush also survives pretty well. So they're actually encompassing pretty similar niches here. So if sagebrush can no longer survive, then what can survive? So this leaves us with kind of a big question mark here. And this is really a brave new world for ecological restoration, because what we've got are huge scale, potentially huge scale opportunities, and we can't put back the native that was there before. So it's really, it's moving away from any framework that we've had previously of what restoration actually means. So a couple of important unknowns associated with this. First, the timeline. So the window of opportunity for this might be very short. In fact, there's already evidence of this species. This is red brome, which is a cousin, essentially, of cheatgrass in the Mojave Desert. Already evidence of this kind of marching northwards with warming. So if this disappears, do we see this other one right on its heels marching through? So there may be a very short, very short opportunity to actually do something about it when that one is less viable and this one isn't quite there yet. Second question I think that's really important is which wins, disturbance or climate? So if we put in a road, if we disturb a whole landscape, and then the climate changes, is the advantage that we've given to that invasive species because of our disturbance, does that affect its viability more than climate or vice versa? That's a question that we don't know. But what we can expect, at least based on this, is that shifting invasion risk is likely, that we're not going to see a wholesale expansion. So every species is not going to become worse because of climate change, and every species is not going to become better because of climate change. That really what we're seeing is species moving from place to place, both natives and invasive species. And what this type of framework can give us is a framework for saying we've got spatial models of what the future might look like. Let's use those to increase vigilance in some areas where we expect increased risk, and then maybe adapt our management plans depending on how climate's actually changing. So if it gets wetter, we do this action. If it gets drier, we do another action. But really what we're saying here is that we need to be prepared to seize potentially large-scale opportunities. And then I just want to talk at the end here for a couple minutes about what restoration means with climate change. So these are a couple pictures from New Mexico, one from 1899 and one from 1977. And what you can see on these is that the landscape has changed pretty dramatically. So this is pinyon pine moving on to that landscape. And the question is, here's where we are right now. We're looking at the landscape the way it is now, but knowing that things are changing, that we're moving in some direction. And the challenge for science is to figure out, is this the direction that we're moving? Is that the direction we want to be moving in? And then what can we do about it to prevent a new invasive species from coming in? And so I'll read this quote, which is from an article a couple years ago in Restoration Ecology that I like a lot. So, valuing the past when the past is not an accurate indicator of the future may fulfill a nostalgic need, but may ultimately be counterproductive in terms of achieving realistic and lasting restoration outcomes. That is, if we're here today and we keep trying really, really hard to put back what's here to prevent a new species invasion, but where we're headed is here, then ultimately we're not going to achieve that goal because an invasive species is just going to take over this landscape because we're not working in a sense of moving in the direction that this ecosystem is going right now. So what are some ideal qualities if we're going to talk about species to restore? And really restore is a bad term for this. We've been calling this transformative restoration. So that is, we're not putting back what was there before. We need to think about a new species that might go into that location. So qualities of that type of species, we want one that's non-invasive. One good way to do that is to choose one that's from a regional area, so regionally native. So if it's not from Massachusetts, pick one from New Jersey kind of thing. Don't go to Thailand and pick your species. We want one ideally that supports local fauna. That would mean a similar functional type. So that is, if you have a shrub, replace it with a shrub. So here's just an example of our native right now is sagebrush. This is creosote from the Mojave Desert. So it's a shrub. It's regionally native. Potentially can support the same function of that ecosystem that we're looking for and maybe be resistant to invasive plants. So here are some of our risks associated with these choices that we have. So we have kind of two choices here. We can either act and put in a new species, or we can not act and just kind of leave it alone and hope for the best. So risks from not acting. We lose habitat because a species invades. Species go extinct because of that invasive species. We have continued invasion by new non-natives. And ecosystem processes like fire, water cycling, those are affected by all of those different things. What are our risks from acting? Actually, they're very similar to our risks from not acting. So we could pick the wrong target species. That wrong target species could become a new invasive species that's even more problematic than what we're already dealing with. We could, in the process of trying to put this wrong target species in, increase the disturbance and thereby lower the resilience of the existing ecosystem. And then, of course, with our wrong target species, we could change ecosystem processes like fire and water and so on. So our challenge then is to figure out where we are, to use science to say, are we at higher risk? Are we over here so that our risk from not acting is lower than our risk from acting? And so we do want to act. We don't want to act. If we end up over here, based on our scientific knowledge, then we don't want to do anything. We want to say we take no new action because we're at much higher risk of messing up than we are of doing a good job. So we want to continue with business as usual, ideally reducing disturbance in those landscapes to keep the native ecosystems more resistant and resilient. If we find that our risk from not acting outweighs our risk from acting, then there are new actions that we want to take. And in these cases, that would be something like transformative restoration, where you're putting in a new species where one has previously not existed, or assisted migration, which is another topic that's highly discussed right now, of moving species in order to facilitate their persistence with climate change. So I just wanted to take you back to that slide that I said at the beginning, which was that sampling of methods for predicting the future. And that all of this is based on one type of method for predicting the future, and that there are a whole bunch of different methods for doing this. So what I would argue then is pretty critical to future projections, to doing a better job of both informing management and ecological forecasting, is integrating across all of these different methods. So I talked about the models earlier on, and I talked a little bit about how they can generate hypotheses for things like experiments, observation, and theory. And so some ways of doing a better job of figuring out where on that bar we are, whether we're at higher risk from acting or not acting, is methodological integration. So what do we need for that type of thing? We need coordinating working groups that can either review or integrate existing data set, existing invasive species, data sets and the information that we have about those. And we need plans for future integrated studies. So here's an example. These are from two totally different areas, but if you have an example of climate change affects leafy spurge in Nebraska, and you can go out and actually set up an experiment where you're either warming or changing precipitation in Nebraska and see what actually happens. So this is actually in Alaska, not Nebraska, but imagine it were. Then you could test that type of hypothesis and see how well your models are doing, and then potentially infer how well they'd be doing across larger landscapes. So that's developing hypotheses for the modeling community through these types of analyses, whether they're sensitivity analyses or ensemble approaches. And then we really need to coordinate with experiments to use those models to inform both the location of the experiment, so don't go to the sweet spot to set up your experiment, and also the types of variables that you'd be testing, whether they're precipitation or temperature, and seasonality of those variables. What else do we need? Data is something that's really important for pretty much all of these scientific studies. It's pretty amazing in terms, for me, from looking at invasive species, how little the data we have that are actually coordinated in some way. So there are a couple of websites where you can go to get distribution and abundance data, but things like what types of management actions have been taken and how effective that was on a particular species in a particular landscape. You cannot get that without going to individual managers or individual locations. And so there have been quite a few calls for sort of a global information network, an invasive species information network. And there are a couple that have sort of started, and hopefully they'll do better. But that's the type of information that you really need. The more data you have, the better your models are, the better set up your experiments are, and the better equipped we are to deal with the future. Just to summarize what the research and management needs are, for research, I think we really, and this is not just invasive species, this is for any type of ecological forecasting associated with climate change. We need a lot more coordinated working groups integrating across different forecasting methods. We need to think in terms of sensitivity analyses, not just like, here's the answer that's the best predictor of my model, experiment, whatever. In management, there's a lot of talk about creating adaptive management frameworks. Well, what does that mean? For climate change, that means having different trajectories, different approaches depending on how climate changes. So if the climate changes in one direction, take this type of action. If the climate changes in another direction, take that type of action. And then facilitated data sharing. This doesn't, this is a real weakness that we have, especially in invasive species management, is that the managers are often not integrated enough with the science to be able to both conduct hypothesis-driven experiments and also report those data. Okay, so what are the conclusions of this whole thing? The first one is that biogeographical analyses, like the ones that I showed you here, can link between species distribution and climate, and that we can use those linkages to project shifts with climate change. So I think there's really an increasing need for this type of approach so that we can both assess the consequences of human activity and also plan for change. And that's not just this particular modeling, but any kind of ecological forecasting in order to do a better job of management. And then just, and this is sort of my soapbox, but methodological integration is really critical for improving ecological forecasting. So I'd really encourage all of you, as you're moving forward, if you continue in ecology, to think in terms of not just focusing on one experiment or one observation or one model, but to really think in terms of what can I learn from lots of different fields that can do a better job of forecasting, because so much of this change is coming. So I'll just add acknowledgments at the end. Thanks so much.